welcome to the last panel. This is the Equity in the Transition to Zero Emissions Electrical Grids panel. And we're going to cover topics on how states can foster zero emission electric systems in a just and equitable way. And many of you know this came up in earlier panels, so this panel is going to dig a little deeper. The background generally is that while many states have set historic zero emission goals, they have also recognized the importance of equity and environmental justice in reaching those goals. Many states like New York have specific equity-based goals that live side by side with our greenhouse gas reduction goals. This has raised many questions, such as, can we reach zero emission grids without significantly affecting affordability, without significant trade-offs? We heard about this with the peakers earlier. And will grid reliability issues slow the transition, especially in EJ communities? And we have an incredible panel here we're really excited about, and thank you for being here. And we're going to be discussing these tensions. So our first speaker, I'm going to do a quick intro before each speaker speaks. They're speaking in this order, is Chris Coll, to my left. He's a project director of the Office of Market Innovation at the New York State Department of Public Service. He is responsible for low to moderate income clean energy initiatives and for working across the department to advance energy equity and for the department to meet Climate Leadership Community Protection Act requirements related to a just transition for disadvantaged communities. Prior to joining DPS, Chris spent nearly 18 years at NYSERDA, where he worked on issues related to energy affordability and access to clean energy solutions for low-income New Yorkers, environmental justice, and energy equity. His comments are going to focus on kind of the lay of the land, kind of, what is the landscape of the issues the state of New York is currently facing. So I'm going to pass it on to you, Chris.
Oh, great. So actually,
You want to go up there?
a couple slides, yeah.
Just make sure this is on.
All right, well, thanks, Al. So like Al said, what I want to do is, start the panel off with some context, right? So earlier today, we heard Chair Christian, we heard the first panel talk about the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And one of the things I want to make sure we reinforce in this panel is not only does the CLCPA set the state on its path towards decarbonizing our economy, it also sets an expectation that we do that in a just and equitable way. So there are a number of provisions within the Climate Act that do kind of set the expectation for how we kind of work to advance just transition. So to kind of maybe enumerate them just really briefly here, because they're all kind of important into this broader context. The Climate Act establishes a climate justice working group. So that working group is composed of 13 members, 9 members representing overburdened communities. It's really important that as we kind of think about kind of the role of the Climate Justice Working Group, we kind of acknowledge the fact that this is kind of a body composed of representatives of these frontline communities who are going to need to provide kind of their perspective and kind of their insights as we're kind of developing the policies and programs that are going to be kind of advancing our clean energy transition. The Climate Act charged the working group with establishing criteria to identify what the Climate Act calls disadvantaged communities, so essentially overburdened communities, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those look like in a few minutes. The Climate Act also kind of really called into question kind of the ability for the state to develop a process by which distributional equity can be achieved. So really kind of ensuring that a minimum of 35% of the benefits tied to the state's clean energy and energy efficiency investments would accrue to disadvantaged communities. There's a goal for those benefits to kind of reach 40%. So those of you who are familiar with the federal Justice 40 initiative will find this familiar, right? So the Climate Act kind of laid this out kind of at the outset in 2020. The Climate Act also does a couple of things related to kind of advancing equity and kind of addressing kind of co-pollutants within disadvantaged communities. So number one, ensuring that the state, through its policy, administration, and even programming, looks to mitigate disproportionate burdens as it relates to disadvantaged communities through this clean energy transition. And then also is prioritizing greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutant reductions. The last two things briefly, Chair Christian earlier spoke about the renewable energy program that the Climate Act calls for. So, the Climate Act outlines a series of programmatic and policy kind of roles for the Public Service Commission to basically advance this clean energy transition. So the Clean Energy Standard being one of them, energy efficiency, building electrification kind of being another kind of couple of examples there. Last two things to flag quickly here. One of the challenges that I think we've all had in terms of kind of thinking about what is equity, how do we advance equity, is really kind of defining, what do we mean by equity? What do we mean by kind of disproportionate burdens? How do we get metrics kind of on these kind of key issues? And so the first thing that the Climate Act did with respect to kind of building a case for metrics to be collected is requiring the Department of Environmental Conservation to develop a community air monitoring program. So that was required and I think was implemented earlier this year for the first time. And then lastly, the Climate Act required the state through NYPA, NYSERDA, and the Department of Environmental Conservation to develop an opportunities and barriers report, which essentially kind of outlines the challenges and kind of the opportunities for disadvantaged communities to participate in, benefit from, and otherwise kind of participate in the ownership of clean energy resources across the state. And so I have one quick slide left and a minute to go. So there's a lot of focus, through this kind of this work on disadvantaged communities, right? So just to give you a sense for what that looks like, this climate justice working group kind of established this criteria and finalized it in March of this year. Essentially, the working group looked at various ways to identify what a disadvantaged community might be, and they landed on 45 different indicators of burdens that communities would face. So everything from climate risks to social demographic kind of issues, housing issues, and ultimately picked 45 indicators to develop a composite of a vulnerability score, which then was applied to census tracts across New York State. So the working group landed on around 1,700 census tracts being deemed disadvantaged. So that's roughly 35% of the state population. In addition to the census tracts mentioned, census tracts that were associated with indigenous or tribal nations, so about 19 of them were also added to the criteria, as well as any low-income household across the state, regardless of where they live. So this is really important from the working group's perspective because as we kind of look at poverty, right, we know it's not necessarily centralized. It's dispersed, especially in rural parts of the state. So the working group wanted to make sure that as the state advanced the equity provisions of the Climate Act, those low-income households were not going to be left out. So with that, let me pass the mic back over.
Thank you, Chris. Our next speaker is Sergio Dueñas. He's going to talk about, can it be done? Is it feasible to support communities and what needs to be implemented to get there? And Sergio's bio and background is he's a senior manager at Strategen Consulting, where he primarily focuses on grid planning engagements, preparing expert testimony regarding integrated resource planning methods and results across the U.S. Sergio previously served as a policy manager for the California Energy Storage Alliance, where he represented over 100 companies in the energy storage ecosystem in regulatory proceedings at the state and federal level. Sergio, you're going to stay at your seat, right? Okay.
Yeah, I'll stay here. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure being here. I come here representing, Strategen Consulting. It's a consulting company that we are helping people, stakeholders across the U.S. achieve their decarbonization goals in a manner that considers community voices and the perspectives of different stakeholders when achieving it. I think that overall, when we think about the transition to a zero carbon or zero emissions grid, a lot of questions come up regarding the technical feasibility. Some of those questions tend to have perhaps more primacy than others, and because of that, there's significant doubt as to, can this demonstrably be achieved with the current technology? And unfortunately, a lot of parties, a lot of stakeholders opt for Well, it seems too complicated, so maybe we can push that question later on. And that really makes it so that we don't ask other questions that come immediately after, as to how much will it cost, who's going to pay it, and how do we support the people that need this the most. So in this context, thinking about equity is very important because equity allows us to think of the potential solution set without considering the voices, the concerns of more parties and more stakeholders. It is very easy to limit the solution set, to limit what can be done to get to the goal that we have. So from our perspective, Strategen and other parties that seek to bolster this community engagement, the goal of equity really is to be able to get communities, stakeholders, utilities, regulators, anyone that is involved in this, to reach a common understanding, unlock mutually beneficial strategies and pathways, and to be able to have everyone have a seat in the decision-making process. This does not mean to do exactly what one particular party wants. This means that everyone gets in the room, everyone knows the pathways that are available, which have not been restricted by the preferences of a particular party. And everyone tries to understand what are the pros and cons of that plan so that we can move forward. It is difficult to do this. It is difficult because it requires significant technical knowledge to talk about this type of issues. And we should not expect someone that is working, a 12-hour day to put food on the table to become a power engineer to go to vote at their council meeting. That is unreasonable, right? So to do this, it is the duty of the people enabling this, be it the regulators, their consultants, anyone that is really doing this, to be able to really take from the abstract and really put tangible pros and cons on the table for the people that are listening. It could be as easy as saying this option is cheaper, but it's dirtier, and this option is not. You really need to present these trade-offs. So equity in this context, and I hope that we can think about that in this conversation, I think means about giving everyone a seat at the table and recognizing that everyone needs to speak a common language to be able to move forward. A lot of that weight falls on the technical expertise to, translate this to the layperson, but it also falls on the community to try to understand that their perspective and what they see is also a part of the problem, that there is more beyond what every single actor is seeing. So I wanted to talk about really quickly some of the key work that we've done in New York and how equity comes into play there. So Strategen, we've worked closely with the PIC Coalition on analysis regarding how to substitute the peaking capacity, if it is possible to substitute the peaking capacity and how, in New York City and more broadly in the state. What we found is that it is technically possible to achieve similar levels of reliability or improve reliability in a cost-effective manner by deploying inverter-based resources such as energy storage to replace fossil fuel peakers. So this is possible. Now, there are more steps to get there, obviously, than just doing the back of the envelope and the analysis. But as we move through and we consider all these alternatives, it will be critical for every stakeholder to realize that their view is from their trench, but there's many others to consider as well. So I'll stop here and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. As a reminder, if anyone has questions, the cards, there are some that still have survived the other panel, and fill those in and we'll get them up here. Our third panelist is Eric Walker. He's the Energy Justice Senior Policy Manager at WEAC for Environmental Justice. He's based in Buffalo, New York, and he brings 15 years' experience in solving social problems through the lens of climate change, energy systems, and health equity. He's championed participatory policies and developed programs that empower vulnerable communities to drive just and inclusive climate future. Most notably known for having co-founded Push Buffalo and spearheading its energy-related initiatives, he was also the catalyst and co-creator of the New York Energy Democracy Alliance. and the inaugural Director of Energy Development for Erie County's government in Western New York, and recently served as a subject matter expert in developing NYSERDA's Energy Equity Action Plan to support the implementation of the state's 2019 Climate Act. Eric's going to talk more about how do we bring communities in and what are some of the concerns that are being overlooked. So I'll pass on to Eric.
So before I get into formal remarks, I'm going to note a couple of things. One, I'm going to try and be brief, and for those of you who know me, that's a challenge. But secondly, I wanted to also note that those are my folks right over there. So I encourage all of y'all to join this conversation in the spirit of participation, hold us all accountable, raise some things that we might miss in the course of conversation and all that sort of thing. So, hearts at y'all, boom, boom, boom. Again, we'll try and be brief. I think Sergio covered a lot of things that I was hoping to say, but I'll add that I am actually like one of those people who, as they say, got it out the mud, right? Like, I'm not a technical expert. I don't have a background in energy, and the time I've spent in this field and in this sector really isn't informed by, an engineering background, although I've dealt with many an engineer in the Buildings and Grounds Department of Public Works, trying to do energy conservation work, performance contracting, and the like. I am not a financier, although I've had to deal with people who dwell in the finance world and understand how to set up revolving loan funds, talk about credit enhancements, and all that sort of thing. So I really did get it out the mud, and that was not an easy thing, right? The practical reality is that when people engage in this space, right, they are met with perceptions, implied or explicit, around their inherent inability to engage properly in the space. And so, I'm one of those dudes who I came up in the 1990s hip hop era, and that is all about, respect mine, and here go to Tech 9, bow, move from the gate now. So that's exactly how I bring that. So every time somebody was whether it was the regional customer service representative for an investor-owned utility, or it was the president and CEO of NYSERDA at the time, or it was any of the folks on the Public Service Commission who were basically trying to dismiss me out the room, was like, what's wrong with you? And it also meant that I had to learn the language, right? And so in order to be conversant while not having to capitulate to this proficiency standard meant doing battle in a way that's, I think, prioritizes both experience and curiosity and provocation in a way that creates a lot of discomfort. And I think that's the kind of spirit that when we talk about bringing communities into these spaces, we need to be open and accepting of, right? We need to be open and accepting of both experience and, to Sergio's point, translation capacity, but also curiosity, provocation, and I think a spirit of iterative innovation that is well outside of the framework of technocratic bureaucracy, because when I start, and I've worked in government, right? And in my humble opinion, the default, operating mindset of both governments and corporations is risk management. And risk management essentially by default means that that we are trying to hedge against creating more space for things we don't want to deal with, And so I'm really excited about this conversation. Thank you for allowing me to bring a little bit of, to let me like drop a Raekwon line in the middle of this conversation. It is also the 25th anniversary week of the release of Ghostface Killah's original album, Iron Man. So if you don't know who Ghostface Killah is, you don't know the Woo, go pick it up. I'm telling you, you will learn lessons because everything that I'm doing in this space right now, you can trace back to a hip hop line somewhere.
Thank you, Eric. He said he was going to raise Ghostface Killah in this panel, and I was like, what? And somehow he did it, so props to you, man. Our last speaker on the panel before we get into the question portion is Eleanor Stein. She's going to talk about how can the cost of energy transition be equitably distributed. Eleanor teaches law of climate change and human rights at the State University of New York and has taught climate change law since 2005, both there and at Albany Law School, with an emphasis on climate justice. As an administrative law judge until 2015 at the Public Service Commission, New York State's energy regulator, she adjudicated proceedings on renewable energy and energy efficiency and mediated the post-Superstorm Sandy collaborative on climate resilience. She was a project manager for the state's Reforming the Energy Vision. Eleanor, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I have a disclaimer. I'm just speaking on my own behalf, not on behalf of the Institute for Policy and Integrity, and certainly not on behalf of NYU Law School, not even on behalf of the State University of New York, simply on my own behalf. So I want to, if I can, try to broaden the lens in which we're looking at the question of cost. And I'm thinking not only of our regulators, but also of government. And I'd suggest that we're not going to be able to put the entire cost of the energy transition on the backs of ratepayers. It's just not going to happen. The costs are enormous. We're talking about a social transformation of huge proportions, and they're costs that have to be incurred early for benefits that are going to be realized later. And that's a real challenge for the kind of paradigm we usually live in as energy regulators or energy companies, energy developers, or even advocates for energy justice. And so what are the alternatives? What are the other options? So I'm going to offer four. I think we have to consider the cost of inaction and with it the cost of delay. And the UN climate governance bodies just put out the global stocktake just a matter of days ago. And this was their assessment of the level of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere and the rate of increase of those emissions compared to the declared ambitions of the world's nations. And this is all in preparation for the 20th Conference of the Parties, which is going to take place at the end of this month in Dubai. And their conclusion was simply the next 5 years are crucial, and that we have already lost the ability to keep the temperature increase below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which was the goal of Paris. So in that context, we have to think creatively and broadly about cost and about what are the sources of funding for the energy transition. And so, and the risk of not advancing our renewable energy transition and not capping the role of fossil fuel generation in our systems is going to be really, really high. And I think the previous panel did a fantastic job on bringing in renewable energy and energy efficiency, demand response, but not much attention to how do we get rid of fossil fuel on the other hand. And we can't reach the target. We can't build our way out of that target. We have to also ditch fossil fuels to get to that target. So how do we look at that? I'd like to suggest that we have to optimize the contribution of public power. And we've seen the shortcomings in the privately owned utility model and even a regulated context. In New York, we have a potential to do this. There's a new Build Public Renewables law, which was just passed, and we're not sure how it will actually play out in terms of implementation. But I'd like to suggest that we think about other options. And on the federal level, I'd suggest that we need a national initiative on the scale of the Rural Electrification Administration, almost 100 years ago, which was a massive undertaking to bring electricity to rural areas in America. It was a federal agency. It did it for several years. They were able to accomplish it. It was, game-changing on the level of the national highway system. And I think that's really what we need to think about in terms of how we reach the kinds of goals that we have. So that's one thing. Second thing is, I'd like to talk about other options for broadening the pool of responsible actors. So in New York, recently passed a Cap and Invest program. We don't know what the parameters of it are going to be, but we know that unless the caps are really, really tight, it's not going to have the power to reduce emissions directly. It may generate funds, but it's not going to reduce emissions directly. However, we also know that right now the fossil majors, the largest fossil fuel companies in the world, have realized unbelievable record profits over the last 2 years since the invasion of Ukraine. So last year alone, 2022, Exxon realized $55.7 billion in net. And that's compared to their net earnings only 1 year before was $33 billion. So that's basically excess profits of over $20 billion. That's just from one company. And so how can we reach those pockets? And here's where I think the role of law becomes really important. So I just want to very briefly call your attention to two legal developments. The first is a decision that came out of the Netherlands, Milieu Defensie versus Royal Dutch Shell. It's in your materials, where the court held that Royal Dutch Shell was responsible for a significant amount of global warming in the country. Netherlands is below sea level, right? So they really get it. And charged them with a 45% reduction of their greenhouse gas emissions. And that's on appeal, but the court has already taken a strong position that this decision can be acted upon. They don't have to hold implementation until the final appeal is raised. The second is a complaint, which is also in the materials, from the state of California, just filed against ExxonMobil and the other fossil majors, charging them with basically product misrepresentation, strict liability for their products, and it has an indictment, long indictment of each of these fossil fuel companies and the ways they knew, the depth at which they knew the climate impacts of their products, and then their many decades-long campaign to hide that from the public, from their shareholders, from the public, and from governments. So their ways are being found to hold these companies responsible, and we need to think about them when we think about who's going to pay, who has benefit, and who's going to pay. A basic environmental law, concept. The last thing I'll just mention is there's nothing worse for the climate than war. And we are not looking today, and we've been looking for the last several years at both a level of destruction on the ground that's of more enormous importance, but also at a real deterioration of international relations. And I'll quote from a New York Times article from a couple of weeks ago on the subject of war and climate, where they said the next few weeks will be crucial. If the conflict spills across the Middle East, it would likely shatter hopes of mustering global agreement on anything else, including the shared crisis of climate. And I think that's what we're going to see coming out of Dubai at the end of this month. We already know that Biden is not going. I think the chances of any kind of meaningful climate agreement at this juncture is very, very meager. So I'll leave you with those things. Bigger picture, how do we look at cost? How do we look at the potential to fund those costs? And how do we look at war? Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. Again, we're getting some questions up here. Some we've already answered, but we'll get to the audience questions soon. We have a series of questions here that we can pose to the panel. They did see them beforehand, so they're not being surprised at the lectern here. So I'll just start with, we've talked a little bit about this. Grid reliability concerns are frequently cited as a constraint on the ability to take the highest emitting generators offline and rely more heavily on non-emitting resources. Is this a proper prioritization of reliability? How can reliability be ensured while rapidly removing the dirtiest generators and transitioning to zero emissions electricity? This came up in the earlier panel too. Anyone want to take a whack at that? Eric, Sergio?
Go for it.
Okay.
Go for it. Go for it.
Yeah, I can start with this one. Well, the beginning of the question is how often are these concerns brought up? And I would say in every single meeting I've ever attended around this topic, this concern is brought up. And I think it is necessary to talk about this concern because the primary value, the primary thing to optimize for in the electric system for RTOs, for regional transmission organizations or ISOs as well, is reliability. Reliability is critical. As it was said in panels prior, the customer wants to, flip the switch and things to happen. And if they don't, people die. Their respirators can't work. Their, medical equipment can't work. Dialysis machines can't work. So reliability is critical, and it should not be, it should not be downgraded from its first place as the key consideration to think about. Where I think it is concerning to talk about reliability is when it becomes a reason to not pursue or analyze other options to attain the same reliability. And there, the key challenge, in my perspective, is that historically, just like the grid was designed to be unidirectional and to move power from the generator to our house, the tools to plan for the grid were designed to plan for a unidirectional grid. And the models that we use, the software that we use, the words that we use, the mental concepts that we teach are designed that way. So it is difficult for the people that work in the space, that have been working in the space for decades, to change their mental model. And they need to. And they need to yesterday. They should have changed it already. So to get there, we really need new tools that are able to identify how these new technologies, inverter-based technologies, work with the grid. This might need to, look at more time than we looked at before. Before, we only looked at a single day, because who needs to look at more time, right? The fuel risk is not endogenous to the energy, to the electric system. It comes from the gas system. So we can just look at one day. Well, now we need to look at maybe years at a time. I live in California, and in California we have a lot of solar, right? And the sun changes what it does, through the year. We need to plan for that. What if we have 2 really bad weeks because of the fires? We have no sun. We need to plan for that. So the tools need to improve. But also, I would say, generally, too, when we think about reliability, the perspective of who gets impacted by an unreliable service, it needs to be brought up, I think, time and time again. The most disadvantaged communities, the most underserved communities, are the ones that suffer the most from unreliable service. Rich people can afford to have their own Tesla Powerwall. Rich people they have their own house, they have their own roof, so they can put solar in their own roof. All of us that live in apartments, we don't have that. I don't own my apartment building. So all of us, we need to think about what that means and the fact that it's still important, and it's still important, for everyone, but perhaps more for the underserved.
Yeah. I'll just piggyback on it and say that I think the priority around reliability is inherently driven by the sort of way we conceptualize the standard of safe and reliable and just and reasonable. And that is like absolutely just bonkers and stupid, right? Because when you actually like dig in underneath what that means, right? Like Nehru says that this is like that standard, right, is open to interpretation. You know what an interpretation is? Somebody's opinion, right? And so like if there's a legal standard open to interpretation and based on decades of practice, as Sergio said, right, that is undergirded by the mental models of people's professional trainings, and then in the statute essentially relies on cost as the major underlying factor of how you get to safe and reliable and just and reasonable, then we have a very narrow conceptualization of what those terms mean. And for me, I think like when in the real world, safe and reliable means something entirely different than, just whether or not the lights turn on when I hit the switch. That's an important factor, right? Because my kids need the lights to come on when we walk in the house at night, or we need to be able to heat our homes and that sort of thing when we're experiencing various, formations of weather. But like safe, right? Like this system isn't safe, right? Because it continually exposes me to harm. It's not reliable, right? Because of all of the ways in which major climatic disruptions, right, the increasing frequency and severity of storms actually puts my life in danger. The city of Buffalo lived through a humongous storm last year. 40 plus people died, right? That's not safe or reliable, right? Let's not even get into the notions of just and reasonable. I mean, we could spend all day talking about that. So I just want to really hone in on this idea that we need to reframe and reconceptualize the notion of safe and reasonable and just and reliable as the core drivers of the work of regulating utilities and other actors in the system.
Can I add something really quickly?
Sure. Is there anyone else that wants to say something?
I have an ancillary, but let Sergio.
So let's, once you go, then. Yeah.
It's really fast. When you were mentioning about how polluting assets could maybe, and also the grid at large could be seen as not reliable for those reasons. Mm-hmm. Something that is also important to note is that historically we've been putting these fossil fueled resources as the pinnacle of reliability, like when we think about them, because they are perfectly dispatchable, and if you want more power, you just burn more stuff, right? But what if you don't have stuff to burn? What if the pipeline broke? What if you don't have enough storage to put the thing that you're burning, be it gas, coal, whatnot? Why if it's so hot outside that your plant is completely derated because the heat difference is now generating even less power? Mm-hmm. So even the things that we have categorized mentally, that regulators, stakeholders have categorized mentally as of the utmost reliance, that needs to be updated too. Nothing is perfectly reliable. Everything is contingent. There is always risk. You can do your best at managing it, at counting it, mm-hmm. but nothing is like the pinnacle of the resource.
Yeah, facts.
If I could just add a couple of examples. A few years ago, a nuclear power plant in Connecticut had to shut down because the water in Long Island Sound was over 70 degrees in temperature, and therefore it couldn't be used for cooling. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty drastic version of what has been touted as the perfect source of power.
That's right.
And the effects of climate change the equation completely. As we know, the past is no longer a measure for the future. Another example is that during Superstorm Sandy, oil was not available, gas stopped flowing. In the big Texas outage, which was largely blamed on Texas wind, was actually largely the failure of the gas plants to function under those conditions. So in extreme weather conditions, extreme climate conditions, fossil fuel is probably more vulnerable than renewable energy is.
I'm trying to tell you.
And so maybe just not to dwell too much longer on this topic, but obviously, yes, we want to remove, the highest emitters, from the grid. We want to weatherize and, upgrade the grid. But the other, complementary set of considerations here is on the demand side. So as we're trying to figure out how do we kind of clean the grid, we also want to reduce consumption, for those households, for those buildings that are kind of, depending on a high, consumption of energy. And so, as we're thinking about the, access to clean energy solutions, the retrofits, the distributed energy resources, we know that, residents and, building owners within disadvantaged communities face a hard time accessing, those services. So that's something that, I want to just flag as something that we continue to kind of keep, on the forefront as we're talking about.
And I know we're supposed to keep this panel moving, but I want to say one more thing right quick, because when we're talking about energy efficiency too as sort of a system benefit and we're trying to quantify and monetize and all this other thing like that. But at the end of the day, we know that the at least I have come to think of, and I'm pretty sure this is based in the outcomes of proceedings and the program development at the state Energy Authority, is that the market-based way that they approach program design and delivery really actually supports two things simultaneously. One is people who have the ability to afford technology adoption, first and foremost. And then secondly, there's this approach that like the stuff we give to poor people is for the poor people who are like essentially the good enough poor people, right? So when you think about the underwriting criteria for the loan products that are there, they're like literally meant for like the best poor people. And everybody else just gets left behind. So again, this is like reinforces this notion to me of just like lack of safety, right? Like it's a financializing our access to these services and programs based on like our worthiness, right? Credit worthiness or whatever, or another formation of worthiness actually does harm to communities because it perpetuates this system of lack of access while simultaneously and ostensibly rhetorically saying, we care about all these people. Well, you don't care about me when you're locking me out of the stuff that I need. Like I applaud everybody's hard effort on this really, really intractable problem, but if we do not understand the outcomes of what we're doing in our program and policy design as exclusionary on their face, like, I just don't know what we're doing here.
So switching gears a little bit, we'll cut back, because a lot of the audience questions get more into the specific about how to meaningfully engage in ways that Eric's talking about. So we'll come back to this. We'll circle around. But we're going to move, for right now, to ratepayer issues. To what extent should the cost of eliminating electric emissions be borne by ratepayers, and how can the costs that are being borne by ratepayers be equitably shared? To what extent must policymakers look to funding sources other than ratepayers, and what funding streams might exist beyond ratepayer dollars? Does anyone want to take that one first?
Well, I could
Eleanor?
take
I'm looking at Eleanor.
I spoke about it before, and I do think there are funding sources that need to be explored, and I think the lawyers and the law students and the activists here need to think about really looking hard at how to find a way to impact and to get those sources, prospective sources involved. And the example I would give is the example of the tobacco industry. It took a long time, but eventually the tobacco industry was made to pay for the damage it had done to American health. And I think we should be looking at that playbook when we think about the fossil fuel companies.
And I'd say even more to the point, like adding on to that, I think there's like this way in which the like, for lack of a better word, cartels that are set up around these various industries, right? Industry sector operators have noted that same approach, right? And are both creating their own doubt, right? This whole reliability issue is like a herring, right? That's akin to me in the same way that like we talked about like smoking not being harmful. I don't know. It's inconclusive. What do you think? I haven't seen. So much refutability here. I don't understand. Meanwhile, like tens of thousands of people are dying of like lung cancer and all sorts. So sorry, I'm rambling a little bit only to make this point that I think that there's while the names and faces might change, the game is still the same, right? So we have to be thinking about like that approach and others as sort of backstops for trying to move legal needles farther, faster, right? Because of all the urgency that I don't need to get into. That would lead me to believe we are only in the beginning of really trying to create new legal theories, frameworks, and then pair that with direct action to support the regulators advancing their thinking on how to actually meet the goals that they're statutorily obligated to meet.
Now, can I add another word? I think there's another source that people have looked into somewhat. I was reminded of it, but Jennifer's discussion about hydrogen. We need technologies like that, or like cryptocurrencies, to be responsible for only using additional renewable resources and not tapping into the renewable resources that we're building up to serve the public at large. So direct directly reaching into the pockets of the largest electric users is one model, but the other is when you're looking at certain technological developments where there's a high risk, should that risk be borne by the ratepayers in the form of using the renewable electricity that they've paid for, or should that risk be borne by the developers of those technologies by adding a whole new set of sources of renewable energy?
And maybe one other perspective, to think about is, we are at the intersection of so many different kind of issues, right? So it's housing, health, energy, and so if you think about it, if we're reducing kind of burdens and challenges that residents are facing on the health side by cleaning the grid, perhaps there are savings that are kind of accruing to the health system, right? So looking at kind of ways to kind of, as someone representing a governmental agency here, we could think of like a whole government approach. Like how do we kind of like look at policies across the spectrum and really look to, align, because it's gonna take not only, the ratepayers and these other funding sources, but it's gonna take all the resources that we have to kind of get to where we want to go, so.
And I would just add that we need to think, if we're going to take that kind of a whole health approach to cost savings and cost drivers, that it's got to be bigger than, indoor air quality, upper respiratory illness, or acute hospital or acute care utilization, right? Like the totality of the experience that people who are burdened by this energy system have is not relegated to their use of acute care services. And so we need to be thinking about how to, and there is like evidence and research on this about how to quantify and monetize and then build into our benefit cost analysis a much more like holistic way of thinking about the cost of those systems on people's lives.
If I can add something quickly here. I think all of these ideas are excellent, but we also need to reassess current cost allocation. Across the US, there are significant problems with how some rules and incentives that have been set up to, for example, foment distributed energy resources to be deployed are actually, furthering the burden, the energy burden on communities that did not take advantage of those types of programs. Basically, there is a real cost shifting issue between better off ratepayers that are able to minimize their interaction with the grid and ratepayers that are fully dependent on the grid because they cannot invest or deploy anything that minimizes their interaction to the grid. I like to think about this in terms of transit. So New York is not a great example because the subway is great, but I live in California, so that's why I say that. But in California, like in LA, for example, before there were trams, right? There were a lot of trams in LA, and people usually used to take trams, and then people started realizing, well, we actually make way more money by tolls of cars as well, and then really to the degree to which people were able to privatize their consumption of transportation, let's say using their own car, then there was no people to justify the investment in more trams because no one is taking that up, no one is using that. And that is a real concern when people look at resiliency, when people are scared of climate change and they still want to have their lights, so they will just isolate further from the grid. The people that have money isolate more and more, and then the cost increases more and more on those that are underserved and that have no way out but to depend on the public, funded infrastructure that is the grid. So we also need to think about the cost allocation issues that we already have so that we can fix easier the future ones.
Actually, that's a good transition to this next question, which kind of gets to like lessons learned. And so many states have ambitious power sector emissions reduction targets, but most of the zero emission electric targets are fairly new. What lessons and cautions about ensuring equity can states that are now pursuing zero emissions electric systems draw from past efforts to eliminate power sector emissions? How should we understand the costs of transitioning the electric system in an equitable manner?
Yeah, this is a very complex question that I think, from my bias, it boils down a lot to planning. When you think about also just decarbonizing the power sector, the electric sector, it's easier to do like silos of analysis, of just focusing on how to do it for the electric sector and then maybe cost and benefits for others, but that's about it. But as I think Christian was talking about before too, is like we need to think about the co-optimization of planning and like how costs might be minimized through that. And that also will give us an idea of the paths that might be more attractive to get stakeholder input and to refine. Since before we do that, it's a little bit more of a preference, really, than rather evidence-based approach. It's very difficult in my eyes to ask citizens, what do you want, option A or B, when they don't know the implications of A or B, or they've only been receiving information about A or B from the people that sell A or B. And I think that is near impossible to make an informed decision. So it gets to that in my point of view, yeah.
I would add that, to me, this goes back to the point that Chris made and Sergio made about the importance of the engagement of vulnerable communities in a process of that magnitude when you're talking about planning the system. And I think we're really just at the beginning of understanding how profoundly that should change the way we do business. And I'll give you a short example. When I worked at the PSC and I was a judge on the case for setting up an energy efficiency portfolio standard. And we decided to hold roundtables around the state with different constituencies to talk about how it should be developed. And so our team had met, and we were going to have a meeting with environmental justice community representatives. And we had a little huddle, and we said, well, we think what these communities are going to want are jobs, and what are the potentials for jobs in weatherization and jobs in energy efficiency, so on. So that's what we came to the meeting with. So we had our little slideshow, and we put that up, and everybody was very polite. And then it was Elizabeth Yampierre stood up and said, well, actually, we have something different in mind. And what she had in mind was, can't you use energy efficiency and demand response to redesign the system in order to allow us to close the peakers in our communities immediately? And I mean, what can I say? It was such a profound, proposal, and really based on the community's knowledge of what they needed, what were the priorities for these communities, and was there any way that we could reach them? And it's just, I mean, I tell that story. I have 10 stories like that about how government you can't just figure it out when you're government. You have to go to the communities, and they have to be engaged, not just to come to a public statement hearing or go to a technical conference. It has to be deep. You have to rethink everything about the process of how you make decisions to get the benefit of that wisdom and that knowledge that you can only get from the communities.
So I have a specific thing to request of the commission that I've requested of them before many moons ago, which is, the state of California in 2019 created this environmental and social justice action plan. It was recently updated, I think in 2022, something like that. And it really does take this whole commission look in multiple tables across multiple sort of dimensions and scales of their planning processes and decisions about how they're going to basically include environmental and social justice considerations in their planning and decision-making processes. Like, we have no such roadmap. We have no such conceptualization of that outside of the barriers report, right? Which is a good first step, but when you read the barriers report, it doesn't actually deal with many of the issues that we're talking about in this conversation, right? It's much, it's a different scale and scope. And that is not where the conversation should end, right? It's like we need a much bigger, again, conceptualization of the problem and of the approach. And I think there's a tool that we can use and a roadmap to follow, or a model we can follow here that I would implore the commission to take a look at deeply. And I understand that the commission is kind of under-resourced and all that sort of stuff. Like, get at me, dude. Get at me. I will help you like fight for more FTEs in the next round of things that you need to do, right? Like that's what the advocacy community can be a really useful tool for. And the second thing I'll say is that we have a real problem to the public participation, to the sort of actual like adherence of a strategic framework. Is we have a real problem in the disconnect between the way that the scoping plan that's supported by the integration analysis is actually used versus the directive way and prescriptive way it should be like laid out in some sort of order, right? As for all the sector actors to follow, right? It's not an actual, like, it's not an order, right? Under Rev, for example, there was the framework order, there was the implementation order, and it prescribed, literally prescribed, all the outcomes, all the stakeholder engagement, all the working groups, and the subordinate proceedings that we're going to follow, right? That is coherence, right? We've largely moved away from Rev, right? Does anybody remember what that was? Does anybody remember what the outcomes of Rev were? Oh, some of those policy proceedings, I remember CES, right? Those are direct descendants of the Rev, right? That are now guiding our understanding of cost, right? And all of the tier 4 solutions that are going to get us to 100%. Sorry, I'm rambling again, but all this to say is that like we have a clear example of how to like put up a roadmap. We have a clear example of how to prescribe adherence to that roadmap. And I don't think that we have those sort of things in place in New York that would allow for, as like a consequence, deep and engaged participation, or a way to prioritize that participation based on some decision support tools that could be really useful for understanding what we do and who we need to talk to in order to get it done.
Thanks.
Yep. And so, and maybe just to I won't deliver maybe on your wish list, Eric, but maybe just to kind of flag, this is
Well,
something.
he'll agree with you that they're under-resourced.
Yes.
And then he'll accept your support of that.
Yep. So, but no,
Colorado.
but within the department, we are working on kind of doing something like you're kind of suggesting, like pulling together, one view of all of the different, commission kind of authorized activities related to kind of energy equity, disadvantaged communities.
That's excellent.
As you heard, I think earlier from Chair Christian and from Skylar, so as we're kind of scheduling these technical conferences, we're kind of deliberately, introducing kind of environmental justice and equity into those panels. We hadn't done that in the past, so this is something that we're working on building. So more to come.
Okay, we got about 15 minutes left, so I think it's time to move to the audience question section. And not surprisingly, many of these questions are the same issues that have been raised, but they're way more specific. And I think there's a whole slew of questions about meaningful public participation. But particularly, it's, I think the question, and Eric, you started getting at it, is like, what would help the most? I mean, there's a lot of things like intervener participant funds, data transparency. I mean, is it a resource question, a technical question? Is it the government, the regulators not asking the right questions or convening the right spaces? What would be the most important things that could be done to boost meaningful participation for disadvantaged communities?
So I'm gonna actually say, like, this is the part of the performance where we get like call and response. It's like, a little like when I say hey, you say ho, hey, hey. All right. So I think there's not a single answer to this question. I think there are challenges, right? And I would love to hear people who are like actively engaged in some of the proceedings to lift up their voices around this. Because I'm certainly not the expert here, but I would offer that there is a clear need to like say something along the lines of, and again, like what's the framework we're going to use to make sure that we don't have a framework for what participation means, right? Like that doesn't even, like I don't even think that that's something we've actually discussed. I spent 2.5 years at NYSERDA basically helping them try to figure out what engaging communities in their program implementation, design, and decision-making actually looks like, because for 10 years I had spent my life nipping at their heels about how to actually do it, and I'd help them do it, right? And that is a great and laudable exercise that they got going on right now. It's insufficient and sort of not the end-all and be-all, but it's, again, a step in the right direction. So, like, I think there's not a single answer. I think we have some inklings of how to do it better based on some of the great examples in the authority, but there's a lot more to be done, and I would love to hear from, all my folks over there bigging you up, heart space right now, jump on the mic and stand up and say something. What is your response to this question? What do you think you need? Because you're the conduit to people like me. Say something. I'm serious.
I would say, my name is Megan Burton. I'm an attorney at Justice, and do a lot of work on utility rate cases. I think almost all of the things that you just listed, Al, I think are things that are needed. Intervener funding is huge. Engaging in a rate case is a full-time job. There's usually 3 or 4 attorneys that are on it just representing one group. We're in settlement throughout the week, and it's really hard to do that if you're working a job and caring for a family and don't have funds for a technical expert. And even to break down all of these complicated terms like Sergio was mentioning, it's hard to engage, it's hard to participate, you want to feel like you're bringing meaningful information. But if you don't have an attorney or an advocate, you're almost iced out. And I would also say that there needs to be more funding your FTEs on the DPS side. There's so many issues at stake. I think folks want to do the right thing, but there's not enough time or capacity to really dig into a lot of these issues, especially for folks at disadvantaged communities, energy burdens, decreasing emissions, public health. And without having that data or that information, there's not really a meaningful and robust conversation about how can we change the system and how can we make it equitable for the majority of the folks. So those are like the top level pieces.
Since Eric has now made you guys the panel, I should moderate that. So does anyone else have something to say?
So I very much, my name is Chris Casey, I'm with NRDC. I very much agree with Alan about intervening funding. I would just add about the rate cases that I think there's a little too much emphasis, and this isn't specific to New York, it's been true of every jurisdiction that I've participated in regulatory forums, but I think there's too much emphasis on settling rate cases. When was the last time that a rate case was litigated in New York? And I have seen and experienced rate case settlements can sometimes come to outcomes that are better than what would happen in the litigation. But at the same time, how much of the most important decisions are we making completely behind closed doors with no public transparency?
Yeah, if I may add something here, I love this idea as someone that has worked with interveners across the U.S. This is critical because the process of doing testimony for any case, even the comments when they're not litigated, is months. Like you really need to absorb discovery. It's a lot of work. But I also thought that there might be value in putting forth some ideas that might not cost the state additional funds, but are best practices that are useful. So I think the name of the game in equity, in a way, is minimize information asymmetry. The utilities and the regulators know everything. They know because they see the regulators, because they hang out with the same people, because usually they went to school, maybe even. So they know how much a proceeding is going to take. They know that if something didn't come out on time, maybe it'll come out like next week, because they know the staffer. They know everything. The people don't know anything. They are not aware of the comes and goes of the proceedings. So if you can minimize the transaction cost to the citizen of knowing when is the meeting, what is the meeting about? Is this the one that I should call in? Can I talk in this meeting? Or are you just going to talk with a PowerPoint? No, all of that is important. So best practice, just communicate this openly as well, and try to have decisions, orders that have the timing of the proceeding, and that can communicate that, publicly facing. That shouldn't be as much as FTEs or other things. And the final one is, when you start a process of engagement with the community, tell them how the process will incorporate their feedback. And write that down and show it to them. This is the process. This is when we take in your feedback, then we add the edits, then we give you a new draft with your feedback. Explicitly state how their feedback can make equitable, transparent, and firm outcomes, rather than keeping it as, yeah, we'll hear you, but we'll see if we can add it. That's all.
I would just add quickly that I think in order to reduce knowledge asymmetries, right, it requires actual people time and resource. This is not something that you can post on a bulletin board online. This is not something you can host on a website, right? It's not an announcement. It is, in an ideal world, commissions would have field staff, essentially organizers, right? And the same sort of regional geographic breakdown that maybe perhaps you have in the New York State around their regional economic development councils, right? Where they are in the field identifying organizations who have issues of adjacency that are directly related and impacted by the various proceedings that are ongoing. And so that they're doing that education, right? And they're bringing people into this opportunity. They don't have to be, eyeballs deep in the proceeding, but they need to understand that there's a conduit for them to put that their adjacency to of the issue has direct impact on a proceeding, and then that there's a conduit for that the import to be funneled into a meaningful decision that the commission is making. The second thing is that along with that, there's this real need to then build up the capacity of organizations who have adjacent issues, but also put them in direct contact with organizations like Earth Justice, like NRDC, and others who can help support their technical proficiency to translate the importance of their issue and its adjacency to a proceeding into the terms that are going to be relevant for both the proceeding and the decision makers involved. That's a whole lot of work, right? That's not just, that's, said.
I'd like to throw in one other example, which came out of a workshop that was hosted by Rocky Mountain Institute several years ago, and was a grouping of advocates for low-income and environmental justice communities, a national grouping. And this was the idea of an upside-down rate case. And the idea was, why have a rate case where the company speaks with staff, they figure out what they're going to do, they get signals from the commission, they do a massive filing, thousands of pages, and then everyone else spends the next year trying to unpack it, and the community groups are at the the last to try to unpack it. So the proposal was, why don't utilities have to start by meeting with affected communities before they file their rate case, and find out what the needs and interests of those communities are, and ideally, do what those communities want and reach some agreements with the communities before they even file their plan. So instead of having to peck away at their already built edifice, communities can be involved in the creation of the edifice from the beginning.
Did that come out of the New York Change Lab experience?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm gonna say it right here, live and direct.
Yeah.
That was me.
Well, it was you and Jessica Azareth.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, I think we got time for about 2 more questions. This is the portion where people start targeting the questions at particular panelists. I'm sure it's not personal. It's for Sergio. You said that substitution of peakers is possible, but what are the biggest obstacles to getting there?
Wow.
Yeah.
How much time do we have? What are the biggest obstacles to get there? I would say, let me start with what is not an obstacle, cost. That is not necessarily an obstacle. A lot of replacements can be cost effective and are cost effective and can happen. So that is an important notion that we must dispel, that these technologies are not ready, that they're not commercial. Not really. They are commercial. They're being deployed en masse across the world. That they're too costly, not true either, and their costs are, we know that the trend will continue downward despite supply chain issues recently. But one of the biggest challenges, I would say, are around, I don't want to get too borderline econ here, but it really is about productization of services. There are services, there are things, characteristics that resources have that they can provide to the grid that currently we are not considering a service of the grid that would actually bolster the economics of other resources. In the initial panel, someone was talking about, it would be a great tragedy if we build a grid, then we built another one, and then we get rid of the first one. That definitely would be a great tragedy, but we're going there in many places because of the hesitancy of people to get rid of their mental models of products of today and realize that there's new products out there. A quick example, because this might be too abstract. Long duration energy storage is fundamental to a deeply decarbonized system because the sun shines less in November than in July, and wind also, is not as firm as other resources. So you need something that can store energy for weeks. But today, we only have products and markets that settle on a day-to-day basis. So how do we compensate the resource that charged in March and then just sat until November? How do we make that resource economic when we know we need it? The answer is not find another technology that can be economic with the products of today. It's create a new product, figure it out. Think about how you can compensate this so that it's even easier and the math is even clearer for the people investing. Because ultimately, whether it is a public agency like with BPRA that it could happen, or a private entity, cost minimization is part of the game. We don't want this to just be as expensive as possible. We also want to find solutions that are economic. So I'd leave it there, but there's others we can talk later.
Careful, Sergio, you're encroaching on ouch words like value stack.
Let me raise another dimension, I think, of this problem. I think we also have a problem of political will to make this happen.
Yes, ma'am.
And I think that can be traced to the role of fossil fuel companies in our government and what extent to which they, have invested in politicians and continue to do that. So it's been very difficult in New York to get movement on this issue when it was obviously urgent 20 years ago.
Agreed.
Well, on that note, we've reached the end of the panel, and we were planning this. Eric was like, I don't want this to be a traditional panel. I think you guys successfully did that by bringing yourselves and your full self here. So everyone, thank you. This is the last panel. The conference is over. Thank you for coming. Thank you to all our speakers. Thank you for our organizers at Policy Integrity, Elizabeth putting together, Alyssa, Kurt, Jessica, the whole crew, and all the folks that helped do the questions and set this up. It will be available online, and as I mentioned earlier, although I cannot guarantee, but I hear there is somewhat of a promise, we will try to respond to all the questions that we got. Thank you very much, and stay in dialogue. That's what this was about today. Thank you.